In Spanish, its name means the Meadows. You might know it as the entertainment capital of the world, Lost Wages, or simply Sin City. Of course, I'm talking about fabulous Las Vegas, Nevada. On average, 42 million people visit Las Vegas every year, and I'm one of them. I love this city. The sights, the sounds, the shows, the people, the history. I want to share all of it with you. Taking you to the world-famous Vegas Strip and beyond, my name is Jeff, and this is the Jeff Does Vegas podcast. Hey there, and welcome to the best of the Jeff Does Vegas podcast. One of the most popular topics on the podcast is Las Vegas history. People can't seem to get enough of hearing about the colorful and interesting past of their favorite city, as well as the cast of characters who helped to shape it. I've had the pleasure of talking with authors, other podcasters, and historians on a huge variety of subjects, covering everything from the mob's role in creating Las Vegas to deep dives into the history of some of the most iconic Vegas hotels and casinos, and much, much more. I thought it might be fun to hop into my own personal time machine and reshare some of those conversations with you. So, here we go. Enjoy. We begin with episode number 36, The Full Reveal. From the Burlesque Hall of Fame Museum, here's Dustin Wax.
Burlesque is really, if we look at the roots of Las Vegas entertainment, it's Lily St. Cyr coming here in the late 40s, early 50s, and performing a sort of traditional style burlesque show at the El Rancho with a comic, usually Joey Lewis. And I mentioned the Minskys before. The Minskys were a group of four brothers who all ran shows out in New York, and really shaped modern, Gypsy Rose Lee worked for them. All the big dancers in the sort of 20s and 30s worked for them. And the son of one of them, Harold Minsky, moves out to Las Vegas in 57. He starts the first Topless Review at the Dunes, and it's really based around the same model of a Minsky burlesque show, although a lot of it's choreographed. It's not necessarily the individual artist doing her thing. It's, an act that they hire someone to sort of fill. But the whole root of the modern showgirl show comes out of that. Pretty soon he's running shows at 7 different hotels, and other people are coming in and doing the same kinds of shows, the Lido de Paris and the Jubilee, and all these shows are modeled after that kind of burlesque inspired show. So yeah, it's really baked in here.
And I mean, you talked a little bit about burlesque seeing a real resurgence in the 90s. Why do you think that is? Where do you think that came from? I've seen it in working in radio and working in music, and the way people will discover music from the 80s or music from the 70s, and all of a sudden, there's a big resurgence of the Beatles in 2010 or whatever. Is it kind of a situation like that? Was it people looking specifically for something new? What's old is new again? Why do you think that resurgence happened?
I think the biggest thing I see is that in the early 90s, you had a whole generation of young women who had been raised with feminism, right? And so they were all raised with the idea that you can be whatever you want to be. You're going to have a career. You shouldn't feel constrained. There can be women doctors and women politicians and women CEOs and whatever else. And yet the society hadn't really changed to catch up with them that much. So they raised with those ideas, but it was still, they were still also told, well, you should probably not weigh more than 110, and you should probably wear a ton of makeup and always be pretty, and don't learn a lot of math and whatever else. And so you see a whole bunch of different kinds of ways that women are looking to are looking for identities for themselves in the early 90s, right? You have the rockabilly revival, you have the roller derby revival, you have the riot girl movement in punk rock, you have all these different kinds of movements and subcultures emerging that are all to some extent looking backwards at previous sort of models, but also trying to modernize those and kind of reconcile them. So they're models of being women and being powerful without being 80s feminist women with the shoulder pads and the sort of man-eater stereotype of the 80s. Think of like Baby Boom or whatever, where you have these very powerful women that are frightening and very masculine. And so they're models of femininity that are also powerful. And I think that's a big part of it, is that they're sort of trying to play with all these different ideas and all these different ways of being women. And burlesque is one style of that. It's a very hyper exaggerated form of femininity in its heyday. And it's also, more in line with the emerging sort of third wave feminism, sex positive feminism. It's not, if you think of the 70s feminism, there was, like the Society for Cutting Up Men and by choice lesbianism and so on, where they were really trying to just get away from the idea of sex as any part of the identity. And by the 90s, they're really trying to find ways to integrate sex into part of sex and sexuality into part of their personhood. And so I think all those things sort of crystallize for some people around burlesque. Burlesque also has this really theatrical element that's very similar to drag, where it's just way over the top. You can put on a giant 12-inch high wig and 3-inch long eyelashes and incredible makeup, and it's very theatrical. There's glitter and sparkle and whatever, and it creates a I don't know, like a glam David Bowie type way of again playing with gender and playing with your identity and creating whole new people out of, or personas out of, who you are, and this kind of fantasy self.
Up next, from episode number 62, Howard Hughes, Aviator, Innovator, and Las Vegas legend. From the Mob Museum, here's Jeff Schumacher.
In 1965, Hughes had sold all his shares in Trans World Airlines, TWA. And the amount of his shares, the value of his shares, was $546 million, which is a lot of money today, but imagine how much money that was in 1965.
Wow.
And it was described at the time as the largest single check that had ever been written to an individual. But of course, when you have $546 million all of a sudden, who wants a big chunk of that? The Internal Revenue Service. So Hughes was looking for a way to avoid that huge penalty, that huge tax penalty. And he came up with the idea that he would move to Las Vegas, he'd move to Nevada, and then he would invest a lot of that money into land and other properties. That's a way to avoid just giving it to the government. So Hughes, on Thanksgiving of 1966, he came to Las Vegas by train, believe it or not. The great Aviator insisted on coming to Las Vegas on a train. And he came in the middle of the night, and the train stopped a little ways outside of Las Vegas where a van was waiting. And Hughes was transferred from the train to the van, and then he was driven. This was all in secret. People didn't know he was coming. And Hughes arrived at the Desert Inn Hotel on the burgeoning Las Vegas Strip and moved up into the 9th floor, which was the penthouse floor of the Desert Inn. And he was in one room, and his personal aides, took up the rest of the 9th floor.
And some of the stories surrounding Howard Hughes are legendary enough, but the ones specifically involving Las Vegas are just crazy. One of the more prevalent ones, I guess you could say, is the story of him taking over the Desert Inn, them wanting him to leave, and him basically saying, no.
Well, that's right. He moves into the penthouse suite of the Desert Inn. He takes up the entire penthouse floor. The hotels in Las Vegas are a lot bigger now than they were then. So 9 stories was, as big as you were going to get. But, those rooms were valuable. They were very valuable to the Desert Inn because that's where their high rollers would stay when they came to gamble. But Hughes was not a high roller, and Hughes didn't gamble at all. He never left the room. And his aides were, they weren't gambling much either. They were guys who were very loyal to Hughes, and they were very focused on their jobs. They weren't spending a lot of money in the hotel, the casino. And so Mo Dalitz, the mob boss who ran the Desert Inn, he wanted Hughes out. He never intended that Hughes was going to live there. And so as the end of December is approaching, so remember he came to Las Vegas on Thanksgiving of '66, late November. By mid-December, Mo Dalitz is concerned that these high rollers who are going to be coming in for New Year's, which is always a big deal here, he wants rooms for them. So he wants Hughes out. And Hughes doesn't want to leave. Hughes has become very comfortable at the Desert Inn. There had been discussions with him and his right-hand man, Bob Mayhew, about moving into a house in Las Vegas. But I don't think Hughes was ever very serious about that. By this time of his life, he was pretty well accustomed to living in hotels. So it reaches a point in December where Mo Dalitz is about ready to send the sheriff in to physically evict Howard Hughes from the DI. And Bob Mayhew, that's the right-hand man of Hughes, he makes a call, the pivotal call to try to avoid this conflict. He calls Jimmy Hoffa, the Teamsters Union boss,
right,
and asks him to intercede and allow Hughes, and to talk down Mo Dalitz from kicking Hughes out. So Jimmy Hoffa does that. He makes that call. Mo Dalitz relents, and he's going to let Hughes stay. But it's right around this time that Hughes comes up with the idea, well, if they're going to kick me out of here, why don't I just buy the place and then I can stay? And so Hughes through Mayhew, Hughes initiates proceedings to purchase the Desert Inn, and by March of 1967, it was his.
Jeez. That's amazing. I can't imagine just having that much money. You know what? I don't want to leave, so screw it. I'm just going to buy this place.
And that's exactly what happened. He stayed there in that suite the rest of the time he was in Las Vegas, about 4 years total. And so, of course, the Desert Inn didn't do that well while he owned it, in part because he had occupied all the good rooms. But
right.
He did own it, and he once he bought the Desert Inn, when he came to Las Vegas, he had no intention of buying casinos. But once he bought the Desert Inn, he decided that these were toys that he would really like to assemble. So he instructed Bob Mayhew to buy more casinos, and they ended up buying the Sands and the Frontier and the Silver Slipper and the Castaways and the Landmark. They also bought Harold's Club up in Reno.
Now, there's a story that I've heard about him, the reason behind his purchase of the Silver Slipper. The story that I had read was that he bought it because he didn't like where the sign was. The blinking light of the sign kept him awake. Was that true?
So that I don't believe is true. That story has traveled far and wide, though. So the Silver Slipper had a very interesting sign. It was a slipper, literally. It was a sign in the shape of a slipper, and it rotated. And there were lights on it. And it annoyed a lot of people, but there's no evidence that it annoyed Howard Hughes. And one of the reasons for that was that all of his windows of his suite were all covered. They were covered. He blacked out the room.
Gotcha.
So the likelihood that a light was bothering him is unlikely. What did, in fact, happen is Mayhew was looking for hotels to buy, and the Silver Slipper was available. That's kind of how that worked. Not every hotel on the Strip was available for Hughes to buy. But the ones that were, he went after them.
Now, from episode number 71, Made in Vegas, host of the podcast Mobbed Up, this is Reed Redmond.
Frank Colada is a former associate of the Chicago outfit, which is the mob out of Chicago. And sort of how the mob is structured is there are made guys is kind of the term made famous in movies and TV shows. And those are guys who have pledged an oath to the mob and committed a murder on behalf of the mob, usually is how you prove yourself to the mob. But then beyond that, there is this huge network of, tipsters and associates and people that commit crimes on behalf or sort of in conjunction with the mob. And Frank is one of those guys. He was an associate of the Chicago outfit in sort of the mid 20th century. And he was a burglar is his specialty in Chicago. And because he was, doing these burglaries on mob turf, he would give a cut back to the Chicago outfit. And he had a lot of friends in the Chicago outfit, one of them being Tony Spilotro. It's a pretty famous guy who ended up being the mob's reputed enforcer in Las Vegas. And that's how he ended up coming out to Las Vegas and sort of working with the mob out here.
And so the experience of spending time with a guy like Frank Colada, I mean, I know he offers tours, or he did offer tours for a long time where you could connect with him and he would take you around the city, and it all wrapped up with pizza back at one of his pizza joints. But I mean, for yourself, this is a totally different experience of getting in a car with this guy. And I mean, he took you around Vegas and showed you some pretty incredible things. Yeah.
And I'll give a spoiler here. So if anyone's about to go listen to the podcast and you don't want a spoiler, skip ahead a minute or so. But he's killed people. I got into a car with him knowing that he was a murderer, which is something I'd never done before in my life. And one of the places that he took me to was this residential home, or this home in this residential neighborhood in Las Vegas, where he had committed a murder. And he told me how it happened while we were sitting outside of the home. And that was surreal, to say the least.
Wow. And I mean, some of the other spots, he took you to places, he showed you where various burglaries had been committed, various crimes had been committed, and homes and residences belonging to other mob related figures. It's pretty incredible.
Yeah. It's, and it was a weird way for me too, being pretty new to Las Vegas, to learn about the geography of the city, because it's a city that, transforms itself every 5 years, seemingly. And so you don't see a lot of this history in the buildings or anything like that. And so him driving me around and being like, yeah, I did burglaries over there, or there. He used to own a pizza joint. And I don't think this made it into the podcast, but it was a pizza joint called the Upper Crust. And he showed it to me, and now it's a Cricket Wireless. He took me to the spot where Lefty Rosenthal's car blew up. And that was like a block from where I do my grocery shopping, and I had no idea. So it was crazy to me to learn about this history of Las Vegas that you can't see anymore just going around on your own.
And I mean, overall, what was the experience like of that? I mean, I can't imagine as you say, I mean, the amount of history and what he's able to show you, but at the same time, you must have it in the back of your head at the same time that this guy at one time was a bad dude.
Yeah. I think in the moment, the podcaster in me was like, I'm getting good tape. Like these are good stories, and I am, excited to see what we can do with this. And I had obviously researched his story quite a bit before I ever met him. So it's not like any of the things he was telling me came as a surprise. I knew the facts of what he had done. Mm-hmm. I think sort of the most surreal thing was hearing it in his own words. And sort of, I mean, these are stories he's most of them he's told before. And so he's used to telling them. So it was kind of weird for me where he talks about murder like you or I would talk about, running an errand or taking out the trash. And so to be in that space where, he's just having a conversation with you, but your mind is just going crazy because you're like, oh my gosh, I'm in a car with a murderer. It was surreal. And he is, he's a friendly guy. I talked to him a lot, and, we had enjoyable conversations when we were off mic. We just kind of shoot the breeze, whatever else. So that played into it as well, where there's layers to the guy.
Was there ever, I mean, this may sound like a silly question at this point, because he's so far removed now, I guess, from that world. Was there ever any concern for safety? I wasn't too concerned about my personal safety. I'm not convinced that he shouldn't be more concerned that maybe someone comes and tries to knock him out. The Chicago outfit is mostly wiped out, but as he told me, there are still probably a few young guys who would, want to say, like, I'm the guy who got Colada. And I think that's something he's probably just learned to live with and realize there's probably a long time, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but there's probably a long time where he figured he wouldn't live to be 81, and now he's 81. Mm-hmm. And so I just figured, the likelihood of something happening while I am with him in this 2-hour span, pretty slim chances. I liked my odds enough to go and do it. Right. But he does have, a guy that does security with him when he does those tours, or when he was with me, that it's his driver / security guard is what he told me. Mm-hmm. He told me he doesn't think he needs security. I don't know. Yeah. And from episode number 78, A Place in the Sun, author of the book At the Sands, this is David Schwartz.
Frank Sinatra steps in October 1953. And it's really interesting because he was up for the part in On the Waterfront that Marlon Brando got and won an Oscar for. He was up for that. And of course, he was from Hoboken. He felt like it was his birthright to get the part. The producers disagreed, hired Brando. The rest is history.
Right.
And I don't think he ever forgave Brando for that, which is why if you watch Guys and Dolls, they didn't really get along on set. He almost didn't do the Sands gig because again, this was reported in the papers. He said, well, if I get called upon to do On the Waterfront, I'm going to skip this engagement. But it was a very carefully negotiated thing. Even before he played, he was negotiating to buy a piece of the Sands. And again, people have speculated that he was actually holding that interest for somebody else. Again, that's we could speculate about that all day. On paper, he was the owner, and he certainly acted like he owned the place. I'll put it that way. He definitely acted like he owned the place.
So when did the other members of the Rat Pack start showing up at the Sands?
So it happened over several years. Dean Martin first shows up in 1955 with Jerry Lewis. So first as part of that duo, then after they split, in the custody, he kept the Sands. I guess Jerry went somewhere else, but he kept custody of the Sands. So he became a fixture there. Sammy Davis Jr. starts playing in 1957 with the Will Maston Trio, which by that point, pretty much his uncle and father would come out for one song, and the rest of the show would be all Sammy, but because he felt loyal to them, it was billed as the Will Maston Trio. So he starts in 57. 1960, when they're shooting Ocean's 11, Al Freeman, who was a publicity director of the Sands and really one of the heroes of Las Vegas publicity, gets the idea to, hey, let's put all three of them on stage together, and we can bill them all together and have Joey Bishop and Peter Lawford show up too. And Joey Bishop was sort of the ringmaster, I guess. His job was to get everybody out to end the show on time, to get the gamblers back out on the floor. Because, Frank and Dean and Sammy would have gone all night, but his job was to, okay, we're just shut it down, drop the curtain, get them out there.
Mm-hmm. I recently did an episode about live music recorded in Vegas, just because being Canadian, I can't get down to Vegas and I'm really missing that live entertainment. And one of the albums I came across, one of the live albums, was the Rat Pack live at the Sands. And listening to that, it just, you feel like you're sitting in the Copa room, and it's just like, that's Vegas. That's what it's all about.
Yeah. The humor is definitely a bit dated at this point.
Yes.
On all levels. But yeah, you can feel that. You can really feel that. Another recording I would suggest is Sinatra at the Sands with Count Basie from 66. It's really good. not least of which because at one point he says, anybody want a casino by the lake, which is when he was trying to sell his interest in the Cal Neva, which I talk about later on in the book. But that's another really good one because you have Count Basie and then Sinatra. So those are both two really good ones.
You mentioned Sammy Davis Jr. Performing at the Sands, and something that I did want to talk about that I thought was really interesting. The Sands did a lot for, at the time, racial equality among the performers in Las Vegas. I mean, at that point, Vegas was still quite heavily segregated, and a lot of the African-American performers they weren't allowed to perform on the Strip. They weren't even allowed to enter some of the Strip hotels and casinos. And having Sammy Davis Jr. there really kind of opened that up.
It did. It's interesting. And one other thing that I found, I think it was in 1958, there was a news story about Sammy Davis Jr. walking around the casino floor with Carl Cohen, and Carl Cohen telling him, don't run over time, get them out here quicker. And I found that interesting because, and it was a story that pretty much, even though Al Freeman's name wasn't on the byline, I have the original release that he sent out and they ran it verbatim. So, pretty much I found it interesting that they wanted to publicize that not only is Sammy Davis Jr. here, he's on the casino floor, which was a rarity in 1958 in Las Vegas. Most of the black performers, they did not let them mix with the guests on the floor afterwards, or they would extremely limit it, and it's interesting. If you watch the movie Meet Me in Las Vegas, which was set at the Sands, Lena Horne is seen singing on stage, but not on the casino floor. Sammy Davis Jr. is in that. He's a cameo, and he's literally just a voiceover. I guess they couldn't get a camera there that day. But it's interesting that they present Lena Horne, and she's wearing this beautiful gown, and it's very elegant, but she's on stage and not in the casino. 3 years later, that's different, where Sammy Davis Jr. is publicized walking around the casino.
As I say, it was really fascinating to kind of read into that and see how they, if I'm not mistaken, I think Sammy Davis Jr. actually kind of stepped up and said, like, listen, if you don't make these changes, I'm out of here.
He was one of the people who did, and definitely the local NAACP had probably the biggest part of that, where they threatened to have a boycott on the Strip and do a protest march on the Strip. And that was why in March of 1960, casino owners said, we'll desegregate. But definitely Sammy helped them get there for sure.
I hope you've enjoyed this flashback to some of the conversations I've had on Las Vegas history. For the full episodes, head to the website at jeffdoesvegas.com or jump into the archives wherever you get your favorite podcasts. And that wraps up another episode of the show. If you've got feedback on this episode, or any other episode for that matter, or you've got suggestions and ideas for topics you'd like me to cover on a future episode of the podcast, please feel free to reach out to me via Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram at Jeff Does Vegas. You can also email me directly at jeff@jeffdoesvegas.com. In the meantime, thank you so much for checking out the show. Be sure to subscribe for free wherever you get your podcasts so you'll know the moment new episodes are available. And don't forget to visit jeffdoesvegas.com for past episodes and show notes.